Okay, the first project that we will do in class is a solar system, as is tradition. And to do that, we need a clean slate. So you could select everything and delete it, but we're going to start from absolute zero. So go up to File, and we're going to go to the project window and pause for a second and talk about how Maya organizes its files. Maya organizes itself, if I can get through the sentence, with a pretty robust file structure. And it's really best if you follow that structure. Here's one, so the alien I showed you earlier. This is what that file structure looks like. When you create a new project, it automatically creates all of these folders. And Maya will, by default, reference the appropriate folder without you having to tell it specifically like where the texture files are. It's going to look in source images. When you export a movie or an image, it's going to go to the appropriate folders. Likewise, there's a scene folder, which has all of the different versions of my scene that I have saved. All right, and there's an assets folder. Your autosaves will pop up there. And this is helpful for a number of reasons. Primarily for us is when you need to move, copy, transfer files, turn in files, you only have to grab the parent project directory and everything comes with it if you keep everything in that file. If you have files scattered all over the place in your downloads folder on your desktop, some on a flash drive, some on your home folder, it's going to be really difficult to gather everything together. And when you don't have a texture that's supposed to be there, instead of something looking like a rustic piece of wood, it looks bright purple. And that's not what wood is supposed to look like. So that's what it looks like. Here's how to set that up. Go to project window, and right up here at the top, click new. All right, it's going to default to new project. We're going to name it, and here's a naming convention that I would just love for you to follow. Your last name, and then this is solar system. I like to put underscores in my file names. It's a habit from the slight bit of coding I used to do. You don't have to do underscores, but it works for me. More solar system, and for my purposes, I'm going to call this 2018 because this is the 4th or 5th time that I've done this, and I've got a bunch of solar system projects. But for you can just call it solar system or solar system 3D basics. Whatever works for you that is clear and understandable. And then you can see you actually have the option to set all of these specific folders and customize them. Just going to leave it all at the defaults. Okay. Oh, did I not? Let's see. Okay. Now I'm going to hit accept, and I had it set to. Sorry, I should have covered this before I hit accept. It's saved to my documents folder and then my folder, and here it is. Here's the folder just created. Created all of those appropriate subfolders. But you can see there's no scene file because I haven't actually created a new scene. I haven't saved a scene. It's only created that structure. Likewise, if you already have a project set, by the way, if you need to set the location when you hit new, you click on this little folder next to location, and you can define where you want to set that project. Okay, I'm going to cancel out of that because I already did it. If you already have a project set, you don't need to create a new one, then you would go to File and Set Project and navigate to that root folder of the project and click Set. Okay, then Maya will know that that's where everything is going and that's where everything is referencing. And we will get in the habit of doing this, every time, and I will remind you, but also for all of your homework and things that you do on your own, be aware it's going to make things a lot easier for you. Okay, so now we've got our project set. Now we can create a new scene. So File, New Scene. I don't need to save this current one. If you've done something magical in the last 5 minutes and you want to save it, feel free. I, however, did not. So I've got a new scene created, and the first thing I'm going to do is File, Save Scene As. If that tooltip gets out of the way. There we go. Save Scene As. The hotkey is Shift Command S. I like to use hotkeys, so that's what I will use, but Save Scene As. And I also have a preferred file, individual scene file structure, and it's very similar to the project. It'll be my last name, solar underscore system, and then 01, because this is going to be the first version. I save incrementally at different phases of a project. So, for instance, this will be more solar system 01. I will call it blocking. Okay, I'm just blocking in the planets in this first version. When I move on to textures, I will save a second version. It'll say solar system 02 underscore materials or textures or color or shaders, something that makes sense to me. That way I can go back through a project and see all of my progress on it. If I want to get back to a certain phase, I can do that. So if I go here to my crashed alien, whoops, and drag that out, you can see how this kind of plays out in practice. And I've got multiple 01s because I do one version at home when I'm getting ready for the lecture and one version in class. That's why I have 2 1s. But it keeps, this naming convention keeps the files in order, and it gives me a little information about what each version is. And I know you can do created by, sort by, created by date, or modified by date. But this version, or this method, really works for me. It keeps things logical and organized, and I think it will for you too. So that's how I would like to see the files as we move forward. All right, so once I have that name, I'm going to click Save As, and there we go. Okay, so now we have our file set up, we've got our scene set up, and I believe it's time to actually start making things. Finally. So the first thing I'm going to do is in this polygons tool shelf. Actually, that's the second thing I'm going to do. The first thing I'm going to do is go to the Create menu, and we're going to do this with polygons. Polygon primitives. Primitives refers to just a basic starting shape, and you can see them all listed here: sphere, cube, cylinder, cone, plane. These are all just very basic shapes. It's a great starting point for a number of different objects. So if you're going to model a coffee cup, you'd probably start with something like a cylinder. If you're going to model a couch, you might start with a cube. And then also soccer ball, because there's really only like 2 ways to model a soccer ball, and it's just easier to make it a starting point. So I appreciate that Maya does that for the one time I've had to make a soccer ball. Anyway, create polygon primitives, and you have this option, interactive creation. Yours may or may not be checked. If it is checked and you go to create a cube, for instance, you can see drag the base on the grid, then pull it for height. So this is interactive creation. You're kind of defining it dynamically on the fly. If you turn that off, I'm just going to delete that. Turn that off, and then go to create cube. It creates a standard cube. I personally don't care for interactive creation. I like to start with the standard shapes because 1, it puts it at the center of the scene, and 2, it makes it a standard size. It just simplifies everything. So turn off interactive creation, and then I'm just going to use this tool shelf because it's easier. Was that? So I'm going to click on the sphere, and the first thing that I'm going to do, and this is a very important step, is name it. Everything has to have a name. Everything has to have a unique name. If you don't do it, Maya will do it for you. But the way that Maya does it is sphere 1, sphere 2, sphere 3, sphere 4, which gets really confusing when you get to sphere 45, 56, and 73. Especially if you've turned that sphere into something that doesn't look like a sphere anymore. And you're like, oh, what is that head? Oh, it's a sphere? No, that's cylinder 72. Name things. So, in the channel box layer editor, and the way that you get to that is you will very probably see a tab on the side of your screen. If not, these icons up here, the last icon here, which looks like 3 planes stacked on top of each other, is the channel box layer editor. Click on that, and we've got some basic controls, and we've got the name, which right now is P-Sphere 1. You click on that, and I'm going to call it Sun, and hit Enter. Maya is case sensitive. Okay, so capital S Sun is different than lowercase s Sun. I've also got some controls here. I can translate, I can rotate, and I can scale. So instead of hitting W to move and moving along the x-axis with the arrow, I can also just type it in that field, hit return, and move it about however I see fit. Okay. I'm going to keep the position at 0 because the sun is the center of the solar system, and we are not going to deviate from that. I am, however, going to adjust the scale. The way that I'm going to do that is, I'll show you a couple of ways. If you hit the R key, it brings up your scale tool, and then with the center, you can click and drag from the center and scale it up to about 5. If you are like me and are a perfectionist and are exacting, you can select all of those fields and type in 5, and it will be exactly 5 units. Okay, these are abstract units. I think the default is each unit is a millimeter. It's either millimeter or meter. I don't remember off the top of my head. You can set that if it matters to you. For us and for this today, it does not matter. But I'm going to set the scale to 5. Okay, so I've created a big sphere, sun. Now I want to see this from the top view. And the way that I can do that is I'm going to tap the space bar, and now I've gone to quad view. So if you tap the space bar, you're going to switch back and forth between a single view and a quad view, and it's going to jump to whatever view that you're hovering over. So if I hover over the top view and tap the space bar again, now I'm in the top view. Or I can go to the side view or the perspective view, but I want to be in the top view. Okay. You can also change views if you, let's see, if you hold down the right, nope, just kidding, come on. So I can't show you the spacebar context menu because my Maya is not working, but if you hold down the spacebar and then hold down the right mouse button, you'll see, instead of complete tool and select all, you'll see like perspective view and top view and right view and front view. You can change views that way. But for me, for now, I'm just going to use the spacebar to jump into quad view, hover over the top view, and hit spacebar. So I'm in the top view. Okay, now I want to make the next planet. And that next planet is Mercury. I'm going to go over to polygons, click on sphere. Now, I'm going to pause here for a second. It does not look like I added a new sphere, but I did. I know that because in my channel box layer editor, it has a new sphere that just popped up. You can also open up in the Windows menu, the outliner. Okay, looks like this. You can see there's a second object here called sphere. I'm going to keep this outliner open on my other screen just because I'm recording on a smaller screen. I don't have a whole lot of real estate. But that's the way I can kind of help keep track of what's going on here. But I know it's there, but I can't see it. And that's where wireframe view comes in handy. So if I hit 4 on the number pad, now I'm in wireframe mode, and I can see, yes, that sphere is in fact there. Now at this point, I'm going to click and rename it. I'm going to call it Mercury. Okay, and the scale that I'm going to set it to is 0.2. Hit return. So now it's much smaller. And then hit W on the keyboard, and I'm going to move it along the x-axis only, about 2 units away from the sun, from the edge of the sun. Okay. So we've got Mercury in place. Now I'm going to create another planet. So I'm going to click on the sphere, I'm going to name this one Venus. I'm going to adjust my scale. The scale of this is going to be 0.5. So 0.5, 0.5, 0.5. And I'm going to move it over about there. So the center is about 3 units away from Mercury. Okay. I'm also going to option middle click and drag and push the sun over to the side of the screen. So I've given myself a little bit more room to work here. Okay, so I've got Venus in place. Let's add another one. This time I'm going to go do this through the Create menu. So Create, Polygon Primitives, and Sphere. Now, you'll notice next to all of these options is a little box. That's a kind of an options, how to access the options for that tool. So if I click on that box, I can adjust the size from here. I can also adjust the divisions and the height divisions and its orientation. Maya will remember what options you set, so if I change this and then create a bunch of spheres, they will all have those options. So I don't want to mess with that right now. I just wanted to call out what that is. So I'm going to close that and just do Create, Polygon Primitives, and Sphere. Got a new sphere. This one is Earth, and its scale is also 0.5, and I will move that a few units away from Venus. And one more time, this time I'll go with the shelf because it's the fastest way. I will create it, move it over, name it Mars, scale it to 0.4. Okay. For the sake of this recording, like I said, I'm just going to record the first 4 planets. As you're following along, feel free to do the rest of them. I did put on D2L relative scales, but again, they're all relative. It's not scientific. So just eyeball it. That's fine.
Is Neptune 7 or 0.7?
First 4 planets created. It's bothering me a little bit that they're not exactly on the grid. So there's a really easy way to put them on the grid, and that's through a functionality called snapping. And that is these magnet options up here in the, I can't remember what this menu is called. Status line is what it's called. So we've got a bunch of different snapping options. We can snap to the grid, we can snap to curves, points, centers, view planes, and various objects. For today, we're only concerned about this first option, snap to grids. So I'm going to click on that and turn that on. It's highlighted blue now. And now as I click and drag Mercury, it snaps to each of the increments along the x-axis. Okay, same with Earth. I can select that and just let that bounce over. And you'll see these translate values. Sorry, I say Earth, that's Venus. You'll see these translate values change. So Mars right now is at 16.043. I click and drag and bring it back, and now it's at exactly 16. It's an easy way to keep things aligned and, organized. Okay, so the part where I said I was only going to do the first 4 planets? I lied, because I want to do Saturn's ring, and to do Saturn's ring, I also need to do Saturn. So I'm going to quickly do the rest of the planets. Add one. I've still got snapping on, which is fine. This one is Jupiter. Oops. And that stays at 1. Next one is Saturn. This goes to 0.9. And then the next one is Uranus. And this one goes to 0.7. And then we we do Neptune, which is also 0.7. I'll give that another space. And then finally, we'll do Pluto. Which is 0.15. Okay. So now we've got all of our planets laid out. If I hit 5 on the number pad, you can see them all in shaded view. But what's missing is Saturn doesn't have its rings, or ring. And so that's what we need to make next. All right, so we're going to create the ring now, and we're going to use the torus primitive. So I'm going to click on torus, and I'm going to go back to wireframe, 4 on the number pad, so that I can see it. I'm going to call this Saturn underscore ring. Hit enter. And I still have snapping on, so I'm going to move it so that it is centered right around Saturn, right on the same spot. Okay. Now I'm going to turn the snapping off, and I'm going to tap the space bar and jump into my perspective view. And with the ring still selected, I'm going to hit F to frame up the ring, and now I've got a good view of Saturn and the ring. But at this point, it doesn't really look like Saturn's ring. It's a little wrong, so we need to make it not wrong, or not as wrong. Okay. Yes. We need to kind of squash this, make it more pancake-like. But also the inside hole is too small. Now, when you create a primitive, you've got a few more options than just moving it around and scaling the whole thing. That's where, again, where this channel box comes in. We have this input section where it says polytorus. If you click on that, it's going to show you some options. We've got radius. These are kind of the starting component options. We've got radius, section radius, twist, subdivisions, and then UVs, which we don't have to worry about. This is in the channel box, and then you just click on polytorus under the inputs. Now, you need to do this right pretty soon after you create it, if not right away. It should be kind of the first thing, because if you start manipulating the geometry, anything past like moving and rotating, and then you go back into these inputs and change it, it can get things really screwy really fast. It'll look like something exploded and then imploded at the same time. You don't want that. So we've just created this and we've moved it, but that's all we've done. And now we've got all of these options. So you can type in radius, let's say we go to 5, and now we've got that. Or if we go to 0.1, that's really small, it's actually inside the planet. If I hit, let me go back down to 0.5, and just hit 4 on the number pad, you see the wireframe. Okay, you can see how it's behaving. Now the outside radius, we're going to set to 1.5. Oops. Okay. And then the inside radius actually works when we increase the outside radius. A note about kind of how this works: you can type in the numbers, but you can also, if you just highlight the word and then middle click and drag in the viewport, you can dynamically adjust it. Okay, you can be a little bit more fluid about it. But I'm going to keep that at 1.5. And then you can also, we're going to adjust the section radius, which is the radius of kind of these cross sections. I'm going to bring that down to 0.25 or so. That works. You can eyeball it. It's not vital. You can also, just so you know, you can put a twist in it. Kind of rolls it around. Again, it's not something that we can really notice here. And then subdivisions are how many vertices, how many edges around and across. So by default, it's at 20. You can bring that down to 5, and you get a pentagram or pentagon. 4 gets you to a square, and then 3 down to a triangle.
What would happen if you got it down to 2?
You can bring that down to 20 for sure. It can't go lower than 3 because you can't create a enclosed shape with only 2. Then you would have a line. So that is subdivisions. The only thing is we changed radius 1.5, section radius 0.25. Okay, now we can go and flatten this. So I'm going to bring up the scale tool, and just in the Y direction, just in the vertical direction, I'm going to bring it down to not completely flat. I don't want to go to 0. But I'm going to give it a little bit of thickness. Okay, something like that. And then, because it looks cooler and I think it's slightly more accurate, I'm going to bring up my rotation tool, and I'm just going to kind of skew it just a little bit. Okay. And now Saturn has a ring. So I'm going to save, and I'm not going to do all of the moons. I'm just going to do one moon for Earth. So I'm going to jump back to the top view. And real quick, if I jump back to the quad view, you notice that the top view is still in wireframe and the perspective view is shaded. Each individual view remembers that setting, which I think is kind of handy. Anyway, back in the top view, I'm going to create a new sphere. I'm going to call this Earth_moon. And I will set the scales to 0.1. And then, oops, I will move it. I'm going to turn snapping back on, and I'll move it right there. Whoa. There we go. Move it right there next to Earth. Okay, so I've created everything that I'm going to create. It's kind of a good point to pause, save, and then I'm going to save as and create a new file. I'm going to call it SolarSystem02_color, because that's what we're going to do next. All right, so now it's time to make this not a gray solar system, but a colorful one. And the way that we need to do that, the Hypershade editor. So if I go up in this status line, we've got this, what looks kind of like a reverse blue eyeball, a little sphere and a circle. That's the Hypershade window. You can also get to it if you go to Windows, Rendering Editors, and Hypershade. But this little icon is easiest. So I'm going to click on that, and it's going to bring up this window. And it's going to think about it for a minute. Okay. Now, these computers have RenderMan installed on them, which is a more advanced rendering engine. We're not going to use that for today. It's unnecessary. So we need to change it to the default Maya one. So I'm going to go up to my render settings, which is this little slate with a gear icon right next to the Hypershade icon. I'm going to click on that, and that's going to open up this render settings window. And I'm just going to make sure this says render using Maya software. Okay. Now that we have the correct render engine set, there's a lot going on in this Hypershade editor. Let's not really worry about it right now. Let's just focus on a couple of key things. So in the bottom left here, we've got our create, and this is how we create new shaders. We're only going to worry about Lambert right here. And what these are, ridiculous names. Usually named after the guy that made the math behind it. In this case, a Lambert is a shader with no specular reflection. It's a dull finish. If you click on that once, it creates a couple of nodes here in the center. It creates a new little thumbnail up there. And I'm going to click on this button to make those a little bit larger. You can see that a little bit better. And you can see there's a couple of other shaders that were already there. Those are the default ones. Don't change any of the attributes for Lambert 1. That is the default gray that everything is in the scene. So if you change that, everything will become whatever you change it to. Lambert 2. I've created a new Lambert just by clicking on Lambert. Then over here on the right side, we've got the property editor. Let's rename this to Sun Color. And then we've got this color value here that we want to adjust. If for some reason you do not have the property editor visible, in the Hypershade window, you can go to Window and Property Editor, and it will pop up. So I'm going to close mine, and you might have something that looks like this. I'm going to go to Window, Property Editor, and it opened mine up on another screen, but I can just drag this around and pop that up right down there. And it gets rid of my preview because, oh, now it's in tabs. I just want to drag it down. Oh, it's getting squirrely. Gotta find the right spot. And down here. Doesn't like doing this when I'm recording. Come on. Should just be able to drag it around into place. There we go. I think. Yep. Okay. So if you're not screen recording, it's probably going to be a little bit easier than it just was for me. But that's how you can get it back, is just up in the window and then choose Property Editor. Also, in the Material Viewer, I'm going to change that to Hardware so it looks a little bit more accurate. But we've created a Lambert. We've named it. Now we just have to change the color. So I'm going to double click on this little color swatch. And of course my color picker popped up behind it. And now I can choose my color. And I've got a bunch of different ways to do it. I can choose one of these presets, or I can just click and drag around in here, change the hue. Or you can go down here and you've got your hue, saturation, and value sliders, or your RGB sliders, depending on what you prefer. I'm going to increase the saturation and go a little bit more yellow. That looks like a good sun color. Click Done. Now, I'm going to move my Hypershade window off screen here, just so you can see I've created a sun color, but my sun has not changed. And so what we have to do is we have to apply this shader to the sun object. We have to tell Maya that these two things should be connected. So I'm going to select my sun, and then my Hypershade. I'm going to right-click on Sun Color, appear in the node, and hold down the right mouse button and choose Assign Material to Selection. Okay. As soon as I do that, the color pops up. All right, one more time. I'm going to select the sun in my 3D view, in my viewport. And then in my Hypershade, I'm going to hold down the right mouse button, and this context-sensitive menu comes up. I'm going to select Assign Material to Selection, and that will change it to the appropriate color. That if you, after you add a couple colors, you decide that you don't like one of them, you can just click on it in the Hypershade editor and go back to color and change it to whatever you want. And because it's already applied, it will update immediately in the scene. Another note, just another way to apply a shader to an object is in the Hypershade you can middle click and drag the swatch onto the object, and it will apply it. Just like that. So now all of the planets have color. The Saturn's ring has its own color. Earth's moon, I did not give a color because gray is fine. But we've got everything with its own color. You can see it in 5 shaded mode. Now it's time to animate them. But before we do that, I want to get you in the habit of saving multiple versions. So first I'm going to save this scene. Okay, because this is the color version you can see up here. And then file save scene as. And this will be 03 underscore animation. Click save as. Okay. So now we need to animate some things. And before we actually do it, we need to think about how is this animating. So there are 2 ways that planets move. They spin, okay, the day cycle, 24 point some odd hours in a day, and then they also revolve around the sun. And so we need to do both of those things. And it will get a little bit tricky, but follow along and we'll all be okay. So we're going to start with the first planet, Mercury. And we animate in Maya through keyframes, just like you do in every other animation program that I'm aware of, although I'm sure there's something out there that's weird. But we need to animate the rotation of this. And if we're just spinning, if we're just talking about the actual, not revolving, but the actual spin of the planet, we need to think about what axis it's spinning around. It's not spinning, it's not tumbling in all directions. It's just spinning in one direction, kind of like a top. And that is the y-axis right here, this vertical one. So that's going to be the value that we need to animate. I still have my channel box open. That's going to be important here in a second. I also want to come down here and look at the time slider. Okay, make sure you're on frame 1. I'm also going to select this range slider. I'm going to draw that out. Okay. I want to animate a 10-second sequence. So we're going to be animating 24 frames a second, which is kind of the standard cinema rate. So 24 frames in 1 second times 10 seconds is 240 frames. So we need to set our timeline to be 240 frames. In order to do that, we come down here to this second 200 box and type in 240. Okay. Just a quick overview of what these 2 numbered boxes on either side of this range slider mean. The outer 2 boxes, so this one and this one, are your full timeline. What frame does your timeline start on? What frame does your timeline end on? The inner 2 boxes, this one and this one, are the visible range. So if you only want to focus on 10 seconds, then you could say, like, I only want to look at frames 10 to 20. Okay, and now I'm just looking at 10 frames here. But if you want to see the whole timeline, then you can either type in 1 to 240, or you can just drag out this range slider to see the whole thing. Okay? And so I want to make sure I see the whole thing, because I'm only going to be worrying about the first frame and the last frame, and I'm just going to let Maya take care of everything in the middle. So I'm going to make sure I'm on frame 1. So I'm just going to left click and drag in the time slider all the way to the left until that says 1. And I need to set an initial keyframe, its starting position. So in the channel box layer editor, I'm going to, where it says rotate Y, I'm going to right click and choose key selected. It's going to create a keyframe. And there's a couple of ways that I know I have a keyframe on this value. One, you'll notice this little red line popped up. That tells me that there is a keyframe on this frame for this value. I can also see down here in the timeline and the time slider that we have a red vertical line here on frame 1, which tells me there is a keyframe for something on this frame. Okay? If I move off of that frame, that red line is still there, but the rotate Y red line is now a light red line, and it tells you there is a keyframe for this value, just not at this exact frame. Okay? So you can keep track of if you've already put a keyframe on this frame or not. Yes. My keyframe for the first value. Now I'm going to go all the way to the end, and I'm going to set my keyframe for the final value. And the rotation that I'm going to select is, make sure I have the appropriate planet selected. I'm going to rotate this along the y-axis. I'm going to go 1080, which is 2.5 rotations. No, it's not. It's 3. Math is hard. It's 3 rotations. Okay. Now, I set 1080, and you'll probably need to hit right-click and key selected to make sure that line turns red and you get another keyframe. I had automatic keyframing on, which is this little icon down here in the bottom right of the screen. If you can see it, it's next to what looks like a man running away from a giant gear. It's the one next to it. It says auto keyframe toggle. If you turn that on, once you set one keyframe, any other time you change that value, it'll automatically add a new keyframe. But you still have to set the initial keyframe. Pretty helpful. I like to keep it, well, for this we can keep it on. If not, you'll just need to make sure you right-click and key selected and make sure that line turns red. So now I have a keyframe set on the first frame and the last frame, and as I drag through the timeline, the time slider, you can see that the planet is spinning. You can also see the value in the rotate Y field is going up as I scrub through the timeline. So we've just made an animation. The thing about this animation, if you click this play button, is if you don't have the planet selected, you can't see that it's really doing anything. But if you have it selected, or you go to wireframe mode, you can see that it is in fact spinning. It also by default eases in and eases out of the animation. We're not going to worry about changing that for this, but that's why it's slowing or speeding up into it and slowing down at the end of it. Okay. If this is going really, really fast in playback, we can change that. I'm going to show you in a second. I just want to get the orbit done first. So that's the spinning. The next part of this is where it can get a little bit tricky. I'm going to jump into my top view again, and I'm going to go into wireframe. All right. Now, what we need to do in order to get this to revolve around the sun is it's rotating in the same axis, around the y-axis, but we already animated that, and that just spins it in place. So we need to find a way to get it, give it a second pivot point, and put that pivot point at the center of the solar system so it spins around that. And the way that we do that in Maya is by grouping it. And we're just going to group it with itself. All right, I'm going to bring the outliner onto screen so you can kind of see what's going to happen here. But now I've got to change this back to a top view. Okay. So here's my top view. If I go up to Edit and Group, a couple things happen. First, the pivot point is now at the center of the sun. Second, we've got a new group name created. And third, in our outliner, you can see that now the planet is in this group. It's the only thing in this group, and that's fine. But it now is in the group. The origin, the pivot point of that group will go to the origin of the scene. That's why the sun is at the center of our scene, because by default, all the groups that we're going to create are going to orbit around that sun. I know this might be getting a little bit tricky, a little bit kind of complicated. Bear with me, we're going to do this a couple times through. It'll start to make sense as we go. So now we have our group. But if you click off of it and click back onto it, that group goes away, and now we're back on the planet. So we got to figure out how do we select that group again. And there's a couple of ways that we can do that. One way is up here in the status bar. We've got this option to select by hierarchy and combinations, which basically lets you select groups. Okay. Another way you can do that is if you have the outliner open, either with this panel layout preset, or if I go back to this one, oops, I'll go back to the top view here. I can just open up my window and outliner, which is the way that I prefer to work. Okay, window outliner. I can see in my outliner, I can just click to select that group. Okay, be careful and pay attention to what you have selected, because that can get you into trouble. There's a lot of kind of nuance things that you need to just take it slow, be deliberate about what you're doing. The third way that you can do it, again, this is the key command kind of shortcut, is if you have the planet selected. Actually, I'll bring the outliner back so you can see this in action. If you hit the up arrow, you will move up the hierarchy. And if you hit the down arrow, you'll move down the hierarchy. So I've got the planet selected, I hit the up arrow, and I go up to the group. Okay, it's 3 ways you can do it. Pick one. Don't worry about learning all 3 ways right now. Just pick one, figure out what works for your brain, and go with it. Okay? Once I have that selected, I need to name that group. So I'm going to name this Mercury orbit. Okay, and hit enter. And now it's the same process that we did with the spinning, just with the orbit. So we've got that group selected. I'm going to go to frame 1, and I'm going to right-click on Rotate Y and set a keyframe. And then I'm going to go to the last frame, and I'm going to set my value to, it's a big number, 4320. This thing is going to be flying around the sun. Hit return. I have auto keyframing on, so that automatically set a keyframe. If it didn't, then you can just right click and set key selected. Keyframes the same way that I did the spinning of the planet. I just did it to the group. And now when I scrub through the timeline, you can see that that planet, let me zoom out a little bit, is now orbiting the sun. I can hit play. You can see it flying around. It's flying around really fast. If it seems like yours is going way too fast, there's something that you need to check, and that is down here in the animation settings, which again is that little icon that looks like a man running away from a giant wheel. Click on that to open up your animation preferences, and under playback, make sure your playback speed is real time. If you set it to play every frame, the computer will just play it as fast as the computer can play it, which oftentimes is way faster than real time. So you set that to real time and set your speed to 24 frames a second, which is, I think, in animation. It should by default be that way. Now I lost my place. Yeah, okay. Set that to real time, click save. Now I hit play, and now it's playing back at the speed that it should be. Okay? So now we've made a planet both spin and orbit the sun. Now we just got to do it for the other 8 of them. Let's go through that whole thing again, this time with Venus. So I'm going to go to frame 1. I'm going to right-click on Rotate Y in the channel box and key selected. Then I'm going to go to the last frame, frame 240. And I'm going to set this value to 360. Okay, so now I can see it spinning in place very slowly. Now I need to do the orbit. And to do that, we group it. So I'm just, with just Venus selected, and hit Command G, or you can go up to Edit and Group. When that group is created, I'm going to rename it to Venus Orbit. Return. Making sure that I still have that selected. Again, checking my outliner, checking the name of what I have selected. If I don't have it selected, Then I can click on the planet, hit the up arrow to move up in the hierarchy, or I can go to my outliner and just click on the group. And then set the keyframes the same way that I did with the spinning. So frame 1, set the key, go to the last frame, set the value to, in this case, 3960, hit return. Again, I have automatic keyframing on, so it automatically set that keyframe because I changed the value. Otherwise, you can right-click and key select it again. Now I can scrub through, and you can see it going. Okay, and you can hit the play button and see it in action. At this point, I can even jump into my perspective view, hit 5, and watch it go. If I want to see it play back even slower, I can open up my animation settings, set it to half, click save, and play back, and now it's going to play slower. It's going to feel a little bit jittery because it is, playing back in kind of fake slow motion. But if you need to get a better view of it, that's how you can do that. But I will set it back to, set it back to real time. Click save. Okay, so by this point, you guys should be well on your way to animating the solar system. I need to real quick go through and animate my Earth, otherwise this next part won't make sense, but I'm going to then show you how to animate the moon orbiting the Earth while the Earth orbits the sun. So the first thing that I need to do is animate my Earth. Okay, and then I need to group my Earth, which I didn't actually do because I didn't have it selected right. There we go. Group it. This is Earth orbit. And at frame 1, key it at my last frame, key it. Okay, that's good. And then the moon itself has its own spin, I think. Pretty sure. I don't know. Let's give it some spin anyway. So I'll set the key at the beginning, go to last frame, and I'm going to set this to, I don't know, 3240 sounds good. Okay. So now my moon is orbiting, or is spinning. The Earth is both spinning and orbiting. All right, so what we need to do, before when we wanted a planet to both spin and orbit, we grouped it. And that's the same thing that we want to do here because it gives us a second pivot point. But when we do that with the moon, like so, is it moves to the center, and we need this to actually spin around the Earth, not the sun. So first I'm going to name this group. I'm going to name it Earth, Moon, Orbit. I specify that because if you were going to go through this a little bit more thoroughly, you would have multiple moons for multiple planets. But this is the only moon that I have created. Okay, so I've got that Earth, Moon, Orbit. And what I need to do is change this pivot point so that it's in the center of the Earth. But what happens is I jump to top view. If I just try to move that group, then that planet goes all the way over there. And that's not at all what we want to do. What we want to do is we want the planet to stay in the same spot, but we want to move the pivot point. And the way that you do that is you hold down the D key. When you do that, you can see the manipulator changes a little bit. And normally, if we were just kind of moving something, because I've got snapping on, that's why. Okay. If I turn off my snapping here for a minute and select that Earth, Moon, Orbit group, the center of this manipulator is square. If I hold down the D key, we've got that little yellow circle that pops up in the center. That's telling me that I'm manipulating the pivot point and not the object itself. Okay, so I'm going to turn snapping back on, hold down the D key and just left click and drag and snap that pivot point right to the center of the Earth. Okay? So I do that, and now if I, with that group selected, if I just scrub through the rotate Y values, you can see that it is orbiting around the Earth, which is great. So I'm going to go to frame 1, I'm going to set my value to 0 and key it. I'm going to go to my last frame, set my value to 3600 and key it. All right, so now that moves around that Earth's starting location. But that's not quite right yet either, because the moon moves with the Earth through space. And so that's the last piece of this puzzle that we need to figure out. And to do that, I'm going to look at this outliner again. And as I kind of expand open my hierarchies here, I've got my Earth group and I've got my Earth-Moon group. And I need to parent my Earth-Moon group to the Earth. All right, I need to connect them. They need to be in the same kind of overall parent group. And the way that you do that in the outliner is you just middle click and drag. So I'm going to take my Earth-Moon orbit group, middle click and drag on top of the Earth orbit. And now it's in that same group. And now as I scrub through my timeline, you can see that it is moving with the Earth. Okay. Okay. So now, under the assumption that you are done with your animation and you want to export this to show somebody, but don't want to spend the time to actually set up a render, you can do what's called a PlayBlast export. And what this does is basically just record what's in the viewfinder. You know, if we were to actually render this, it would look something like this. If you spent time with lights and environments, you could get something really nice. But we just want to export this so that I can see what you've done. It's just to show me the actual animation and your progress. I don't need to see a final polished version. Playblasting is also something you would do if you were, let's say you're animating a walk cycle and you just want to send it off to the director and get some feedback on the motion, but it doesn't have to be the full rendered with all the textures. Playblasting is useful in that way. In order to do this, you go to the timeline and you right click, and we've got Playblast. And I'm going to click on the box to the side of it, and that's going to bring up our options. You can choose your format. You can choose your encoding, H.264. Display size from window or from render settings. So this is going to do whatever you're seeing in the viewport. So I would frame your viewport up in a somewhat interesting way, something like this, so that you can see what's happening. You can set your scale. I'll keep it at 1. Frame padding, don't worry about. And then we want to save to file. Okay, and we can name this movie file. I will name the Solar System 03 animation. Click. You don't have to click browse because by default it's going to save it to that project that we created. Okay, I mean if I click it, you'll see it's got me, the project that I created, and then the movies folder. Okay, this is another reason why following this project structure is very useful. Okay, and then I'm going to click Playblast, and it's going to run through the animation real quick, and that's it. It's super fast. QuickTime pops up immediately, and I can play it back. Okay, that is the absolute fastest way to kick out a video of your animations. If you want to access the actual file, go to your Finder, find your project, go to the Movies folder in that project, and there's the file. Just like that.